From the Office of the Dean of the Graduate School, this is Grad Futures, conversations exploring graduate student futures and all things professional development. I'm your host, Hellen, a new media fellow at the Graduate School and a student in the Department of English at Princeton. Today, I'll be speaking with Jason McSheene. Jason McSheene is a medical science communications specialist at Meditech Media, where he focuses on strategic communications and education of essential information about clinical trials for healthcare providers. His commitment to biomedical research, combined with his passion for science communication and scientific literacy, has charted a unique career path as a medical writer. Jason has served as the Associate Medical Director at Apothecom, a global medical communications agency. And in 2019, he ran a successful campaign and was elected to the Board of Education in Hamilton Township, New Jersey, where he continues to serve as a school board member. In addition to promoting scientific literacy, he's committed to championing education, equity, and empathy. Jason earned his PhD from the Department of Molecular Biology in Developmental Biology in 2015 at Princeton. While at Princeton, he created and co-hosted a podcast, PhD in Progress, for graduate students and postdocs interested in exploring careers within and beyond academia to promote personal and professional development. Jason, welcome to the podcast.
Oh, thank you for having me. Wow, it feels like you did a lot of homework on me, and I was not prepared for that, but thanks for that intro.
It's a great pleasure to talk to you. I mean, in a way, you are what you created with your peers, the podcast PhD in Progress, was ahead of the curve, definitely ahead of the institutional curve. I mean, we've just sort of started this endeavor. Can you cast your mind back to that time and talk about what was happening and what drove you to launch PhD in Progress?
Yeah, so I had been a lifelong radio lover, like just morning talk show radio, nothing that crazy. So when podcasting kind of came around in the mid 2000s or so, I was kind of already all in. At that point, there weren't really that many podcasts to begin with, but the cool thing that podcasting kind of afforded were more niche shows, right? So I found shows on video games. I'm a big nerd, so there are video game podcasts or Star Wars podcasts. I loved all of that stuff. And at the time, there were only a few ones to go around, so I kind of listened to them as much as possible. But back in 2014 or so, when we did the podcast, I had been listening to kind of businessy shows and self-development and personal and professional development shows, but I never heard anything that was really geared towards graduate students. And if they were, they were good shows, but they weren't really saying the types of things that we wanted to say. And really our goal with the show was to provide those kinds of tools that I heard really that were provided for business professionals, people within my age range and experience age range, but were in industry. I don't want to bring that over to academia.
Yeah. Can you remember some of the conversations that you had, just as an example for our listeners? What were the gaps for you guys that you were like, well, we need to talk about this, and have community?
Yeah, there were a lot. So, it wasn't a long running show. We did about 20 episodes, and then by that time, most of us were already finished with our PhD and kind of doing new things. But, those conversations were those ones that we tried to have with our friends when we're outside of lab and we're just hanging out on a Friday or Saturday night at our graduate student bar, which you might be familiar with or not. But, it was those conversations of, what do I want to do with my life when I grow up? It was the conversations of, is what I'm doing here important or not? It was that conversation of how do I choose which lab I want to be in after doing my 3 rotations or 4 rotations if you had to. It was just those common conversations that I think what we in part wanted to do were kind of open that up to people outside of Princeton. Because I and my friends, Nikhil and Abigail and Kelly, we really had, I think, positive experiences overall. And we also know that a lot of people didn't necessarily have a great positive experience. And we want to kind of give some shelter to those conversations and really allow them to breathe. So, it became the big question. I think the kind of general question that the podcast was trying to answer was, how do you explore those opportunities beyond academia when we're kind of siloed a bit?
Mm-hmm.
And I think the ways to approach that were really trying to reach out to people that we could talk to that were willing to speak with us, many of whom had been through graduate school or were associated with higher ed in some way or another, but some weren't. And I think the important part was really just stretching beyond what we expected or what we believed were expected of us. So having those thoughts of and really giving yourself the permission to explore. When I was thinking in grad school, do I want to become a professor? I was looking at what the professors around me were doing, and I loved their work, but also I was like, I can't write grants all day, every day. Like, that's just not me. What I did love, I loved giving lab meetings, even if I had no data, even though it was stressful, even though I'd be like, oh my God, my lab's going to kill me because I don't have all the data or anything like that. I liked giving presentations to my department. So in Mobile, we had grad student colloquia where, grad students were invited to give their work and actually were kind of required to. And those were great experiences, even though every time was not a hit for me. I definitely remember freezing up there one time. It was not a good presenting experience, but I enjoyed the process of trying to create a story behind the science. And so kind of looking back on how I got to explore my career was thinking of the things I enjoyed the most. I enjoyed putting together presentations. I enjoyed creating the scientific story. I did not enjoy getting into lab at 8 a.m. to get my experimental fish ready and then staying in lab till 3 a.m. To be on the microscope and then trying to do it the next day again to just get data. That was not my favorite part.
No, it sounds long, arduous.
Yeah. I mean, and it has its pros and cons. I mean, everything does, right? So even though, in my experience, grad school was very open to what I was trying to do with it. It didn't have those sharp edges and boundaries necessarily that kind of can push you along very hard. So, there are definitely times in which it was difficult for me to come into lab every day. And I think every grad student, especially in the middle to near the end, kind of struggle with that a little bit. And I realized at that point, there are attributes to my work that I want. Like, I want to work with a team. I want to be able to create something tangible in a way that doesn't take necessarily 3 or 4 years to create. And so kind of taking in all those factors, like it just kind of pushed me towards industry and figuring out how to take my interest there.
Well, even as you were talking about giving the presentations, like, you sound very jovial. You're very excited. What about that aspect of your work was really exciting for you? Like, you look happy.
Yeah, no, it was a good time. I mean, I had good times. I think, there's a lot that kind of goes into it, and it's not sunshine and rainbows all the time. It is challenging work. But for me, putting together the presentations, I got to do lots of things in PowerPoint, which to this day I actually do professionally and make really, I'll say I make really nice professional PowerPoints that healthcare providers use to educate other healthcare providers. I had to contextualize my work, which was basically zebrafish genetics, in a way that was understandable by people who've worked on flies, who worked on yeast, who worked on bacteria, who worked on tree evolution, things like that. So there was kind of the frame setting, and I think overall I just enjoyed, after all was said and done and kind of getting some lab experiments done, sitting back and looking at the data and understanding where it all fits and how it kind of really added to a new piece of the puzzle to help the field overall. And I've done lots of introspection lately, and one of the things I personally enjoy a lot is supporting others, and I think presenting work or creating the presentations more specifically than necessarily being up there was my way to support the field and support my lab, because the better quality work I did and better quality work I was able to present or write into a grant, the more funding our lab might receive, or the more notoriety our field might receive, and that's how I saw myself as a graduate student.
I mean, that sounds like purpose. That sounds like it's meaningful work. Like it's all sort of embedded in there, thinking about just the things that you are interested in, which is scientific literacy, empathy, and equity work. Can you maybe say a little bit more in regards to how all these themes are sort of have created this path that you have, or have been a way to create a meaningful career as you sort of get out further and further away from the PhD process itself?
Yeah, those are good questions. So I think something that I've more stumbled on, and people a lot wiser, much more wiser than I am, have known for a while, is that you don't need to address all your passions and interests with one thing. And if in your heart you're an academic and that's what you love, and you love that pursuit of research notoriety and first discoveries and getting published as much and as frequently as possible, and that's your thing, that's totally great. It's the self-awareness that matters to me. So I was able to it's kind of a fun story how I got my job, but the short version was that my former co-host on the podcast, Abigail, had reached out to me and said, hey, I'm going to meet this lady named Joelle, and she's my friend from some exercise class. She's going to talk to me about medical writing. And at that point I had been looking for jobs, and I was kind of trying to get myself a postdoc in the industry, thinking that would be a good way to transition, but nothing was really panning out. So I was like, sure, let me go to the local neighborhood restaurant, one of them in Princeton. And so we kind of met and had dinner. And the lady Joelle was someone I actually recognized, because years before I graduated, someone had invited me to give a talk to the Princeton alumni, area alumni group. And so I happened to stumble into that. That's a whole other story, but I stumbled into it and I said yes. It was saying yes to an opportunity that was kind of unexpected and random. And this lady, Joelle, was there years before I met her again for dinner. And I remember her because she had cool hair and she had a really big personality and talked to me about diabetes. And that's what I wanted to actually go into, because a lot of my family has diabetes and I was always interested in learning about it. So long story short, it was like just saying yes to that opportunity to give a presentation during an alumni lunch that's really solidified my path into medical writing, which is something I didn't even know existed much before I had that lunch.
What was the shift in terms of, so once you discovered and had this conversation with Joelle,
Mm.
and learned about the position. Was that an immediate shift for you between like, okay, I'm not doing postdocs anymore. I'm
Yeah.
taking this other direction.
I think, I had decided a little bit before that,
Mm-hmm.
but it wasn't more than a couple of weeks before meeting Joelle. So, I'd been on interviews and, things were looking good. And someone, some companies had to pick another candidate over me, or just things didn't work out, which is fine. So I was exploring different types of opportunities that were in the same realm
Mm-hmm.
of kind of supporting the scientific side in the industry in pharmaceuticals and biotech. And there's a ton out there that, I think that's the hardest part. That's one of the hardest parts about transitioning out from academia, is that there's so much out there that you don't understand and just haven't been exposed to. So like, and it's for all fields. It's not just for science and not just for, any kind of major. For example, right? Like when I think of lawyers, I think of people who go to litigation, maybe
Right.
people who are doing contracts. On the school board side, if there are lawyers all the time protecting rights of students, protecting, school boards, everything like that. I never thought, hey, if I go or if I work with a company, a pharmaceutical company, they have lawyers who are somewhat scientific savvy or science
Mm-hmm.
savvy that really try to mitigate the risk and make sure that everything is good with the FDA and regulatory agencies. And that's a path that if someone was wanting to go to law school and also liked medical science, that would be a cool role for them.
Right.
Um, and just, there's 100 of those possibilities. There are creative people, so graphic designers who I work with daily,
Mm-hmm.
um, who are in charge of making those pretty graphs, those awesome interactive, like protein ligand binding cell signaling pictures and movies that you might have seen before on TV, where it's like 3D models flying in from all over the place. That's a combination of having artistic talent or skill that you've developed, both probably,
Right.
and being able to understand when people like me say, hey, I need two cells, one's a neuron and one's a blood cell, and I need them kind of trying to interact some way or another. That's all those interactions, all those domains of expertise are things you don't see interface that often, especially in academia, where everyone you're surrounded by is either doing their own work or you're working with them, but they have a very specific skill set that helps you further along a project, but not really outside of the general field that you're working in.
Do you have a sense of what that word means for you and in your role now?
What, the translation part?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I yeah, it's funny because it all rolls into each other. There's not, it doesn't, from in my life, it doesn't feel like there was a really firm stopping point and then I really jumped into something new. Obviously I finished my dissertation, I graduated, I got
Right.
hooded, I did the whole thing. There's a big ceremony. We went out to sushi dinner afterwards. Like, that's fine. I started a new job. I had a sushi dinner before that. I like sushi a lot. But, you know, it, I'm still the same person, kind of going through. And throughout graduate school, at the beginning, I was like, okay, I'm going to do my best to learn everything about the field. And then at the end of graduate school, I'm like, okay, I know this very little bit about this broad field, and that's all I'm equipped to know, and maybe make some connections across, which is good. I think the translating the graduate student skills, like, it's increasingly I am thinking not so much graduate student skills, but life skills overall,
Mm-hmm.
because it's everything I was doing. Even like in graduate school, it wasn't just the research parts or anything. It was the the being able to commute. There was the paying rent on time. It was everything involved in living during that time as a graduate student or doing graduate research that made my current work possible. So it included, I made it a priority in my graduate student life, and we talk about this on the podcast too. One of my favorite episodes was the dating in grad school, which was really funny going back. But I had made it a life priority because I was like, I don't want this time. I don't want to look back on this time and be like, oh man, I did so much work and I'm really proud of it. But also I was I don't want to think back to a time where I might have been very lonely.
Right.
And so, thankfully I had like good experiences, and I met the woman who became my wife years later. And I think that was really important. And again, that was part of my graduate student experience. And it's really hard for me to separate that all out because it all kind of still rolls along. And I still have a boss. I still have one-on-one meetings with them. I still have responsibilities to them and people I'm training.
Right.
So it's hard for me to answer that, but I think it's I would caution against like thinking, okay, once you leave your current lab or research group, that's life is over and you're doing something new. Even if you are doing something completely new, even if you're a professional musician in the subway of New York City, like
right,
perfect. Like you still have those experiences that mean something for sure.
Yeah, that the life experiences that you're having now are integral to who you are as a person and how you're going to move once you're hooded and you have your doctor title and out in the world. I think that's also part of sort of breaking down this idea that what we do in school is somehow separate from what we can do and be in the real world, quote unquote.
Yeah, exactly. And it's not just school. It's in my professional life, it's the same kind of thing. I'm like still learning skills that are translating into what my home life is and what my home life, when I'm working with my young family or really trying to figure out how to, get projects done around the house. That kind of works the other way and kind of works into how I communicate with my team at work. Yeah.
Well, I feel like I'm really curious about this in the sense that, it's been 13, 14 years since you started.
Okay, let's not. No, I'm kidding. I was just thinking about it, and actually, I had a dear friend who was again she was my lab mate at Princeton, and she came in. She was my age and came in with a 1-year-old baby girl, and I told her this the other day. I'm in awe of how she did everything and seemingly kept it together, and now she again just so beyond me what she's accomplished. And I don't know why I just said this. I forget what he said to make me think about it, but yeah. Oh, sorry. What were you saying? I'm just thinking about my friend now and just how proud I am of everything she does.
Well, they'll be our next guest.
Yeah, you might. I'll definitely let her know.
Yeah, I was just gonna ask. Well, at least as someone who's sort of in the program now, it really can seem like the value of my time that I'm spending here and now is going to be measured by, the job that I get after, or publications, or whatever I do next. And that feels really rigid. So I'm curious, having spent some time accommodating or acclimating to being Dr. McSheene, and having the path that you have now, like what is the value of your PhD to you currently?
Yeah, that's a good question. So, obviously in my professional life, for medical writers, it's generally common to have an advanced degree. So most people at my current company are PhDs. At my previous one, There are a lot of PhDs and PharmDs, so pharmacists, which makes sense, right? And they are, there is a lot that I think comes from a PhD. So, like, for example, when comparing to PharmDs who have a different path, it's not really a one-to-one comparison of what we do, but there are strengths and weaknesses. So, like, strengths for PhDs are being able to think long-term and understand like where different projects go along the kind of understanding of a field or getting something done, and being able to do that deep research and wide research of figuring out what kinds of information you need and where to get them, and how to obtain them, right? PharmDs, for example, and just to throw it out there for contrast, they don't necessarily have the 5, 6, 7 years of research under their belt. So, working on long projects isn't necessarily what they're used to. But on the flip side, they've more often than not have had patient experience. So, like, have interacted with patients on some level. And they are intimately acquainted with the different medications that are available. So if you say a drug name, they know exactly what it does and how much to take and all those parameters, which as a PhD, like, unless you're working on a specific disease, you probably don't know that necessarily.
Right.
Yeah. I guess in the bigger picture of like, what does a PhD mean to me? Like, I think everyone, my friends Abigail and Nikhil, Kelly, and even Alex, who joined the podcast a little later, the group of us, we're always of the opinion that PhD is just really a demonstration that you've understood how you learn, or at least you put a lot of time into figuring out how you learn. And maybe it's not ever a complete journey. Maybe you don't always get there all the way, but you have spent a lot of time in understanding how you learn the best. And I think that's more important than any of the actual scientific information, because I can always go relearn that. If some magic spell were cast on me and I forgot all the factual data of science, but I retained my experience of understanding how I learn, I think, I could get by again.
Right.
It would be challenging, but I could get by again.
I think that's something that I'm still working on. Yeah.
No,
how did you feel when you were hooded?
I was like, I'm done. I finished in about 6.5 years or so. So I felt ready to be done, and I feel, that's kind of how everyone feels, I imagine. Yeah. You, especially if you've worked on pretty much the same project or same path for a long time, which I did. I was just kind of ready to move on and bring my talents somewhere, even though I'm sad. Like, I still live near Princeton, so every now and then I stop by and kind of walk through the old spots, and but everyone I knew is kind of away from there now, other than some of the professors who are still there. All the I had some undergrad friends from nerdy video game clubs, and now they're all like postdocs, and some are becoming professors and doing other cool things, working at startups, or all these things that, for me, I was ready to be done and kind of move on, and excited. I was excited to see a new setting, for sure.
Well, I mean, I feel like I've just sort of exposed how early in the program I'm in. This is so hopeful.
That's perfect.
By year 5, we'll have another conversation. My tune will have changed.
Oh man, yeah. So it's just funny because I'm just thinking back to like when we did our PhD in Progress podcast. Like, I think it was near that last year and a half or so, where we're like, okay, we just need to get do our last experiments, guys. Okay, we can hang in there. We're tired. And it was kind of actually recording the show was kind of our refuge for a bit. It was like, all right, will we do it on 2 p.m. on Wednesday? You finished your experiments, like, or you set them up or whatever? Okay, cool. Let's do it for an hour. Let's get out an episode or whatever. So I think you can hear that reflected in some of the episodes for sure. And part of the podcast, I think, was to kind of give that feeling and information to people who are more junior in their graduate studies for sure. Let them see, hey, it's all kind of temporary. Even when we're like feel like we're struggling a bit, obviously we all finished up. And finishing doesn't necessarily mean that you get your PhD. If you felt like, exiting the program, which some people choose to, and we had one of my favorite episodes was with my friend Doug, who wasn't in MoBio, but he was in the Princeton graduate school, and he decided to leave. And I think it was great because it was, a move in self-awareness, and he has lived quite the life. He's lived in Europe and Africa, and has done like software startup company. Like he's done a lot of really cool things. And it's those stories again that we really wanted to convey to people, that there isn't that one path that I think you were kind of alluding to. There, there's definitely not that one singular path for everyone. But it is on us to explore those opportunities, because there's no one, not your boss, not your parents, not your younger siblings. They're not going to be able to push you to do anything. I mean, they can push you to do stuff, but like, that's not really going to be the satisfying path for you, for sure.
Definitely. Do you have any final parting words of advice?
Oh man, so many. I can for 2 more hours. Let's see, parting words. So, for now, let me think. I would say totally be honest with yourself in graduate school, if that's where you are now, or if you're thinking about coming to graduate school. Just talk to people and listen to shows like this wonderful one, and now there are more graduate student podcasts, so definitely like explore and get some opinions. But no one's gonna be able to tell you what you should do or shouldn't do. Just take the time to really understand, or at least acknowledge when you're having fun and what is resonating with you. Like when I was giving presentations that I had worked on, and I knew back and forth and backwards and forwards, and I knew all the data and knew the answers to questions, like that was really fun for me. And that might not be fun for everyone. I know it's not fun for everyone. I know sometimes it wasn't super fun for me, but really just figure out those trends in someone's life, I think, is fundamental to, I hate to say happiness, because like what does happiness mean? But like fundamental to a life that you feel is being lived more well than not.
Mm-hmm. Having confidence maybe in the path that you're in.
Yeah, totally.
Well, Jason, this has been so great. Thank you for joining us.
I had a lot of fun. Thanks for the invitation to come.
Thank you, Helen and Jason, for that great conversation. I'm Eva Kubu, Associate Dean for Professional Development and Director of Grad Futures at the Graduate School. After every episode of the Grad Futures podcast, I offer a few key takeaways for our listeners about ways they might apply the advice and insights shared by our guests. In this episode, graduate alumnus Jason McSheene's story highlights how blending your personal and professional passions and interests can lead to increased fulfillment, happiness, success, and impact in your work and life. I remember when Jason and his peers launched their PhD in Progress podcast, and thinking back then how impressed I was with their ability to curate topics and have honest, authentic conversations about the importance of graduate student professional development at a time when many institutions, including Princeton, were just beginning to invest in this area. They helped catalyze a sort of grassroots movement on this topic, and in so doing, they were elevating their own voices and skills while providing sage advice for their peers. Jason described a process of exploration and introspection that led to self-discovery and a deep understanding of his values and his purpose, and the ways he could translate those, as well as his skills, into professional and volunteer work. When looking back at his career trajectory, there were common themes that he was able to deftly weave together in his why, as he describes himself as a champion of education, equity, and empathy. That sort of clarity and confidence comes from having a growth mindset and making time for professional and personal development. It also comes from intentionally building connections to the vast social and intellectual ecosystem on campus beyond your department. My colleagues at Grad Futures, Assistant Deans James Van Wyk and Sonali Majumdar, recently wrote an article for Inside Higher Ed entitled Shape Your PhD. In that article, they advise graduate students to intentionally approach their PhD experience as a way not only to gain disciplinary training and expertise, but to build interdisciplinary skills, collaborations, and connections by embracing the many resources, programs, potential collaborators, and mentors available throughout the campus ecosystem. So how can you get started? First, make time and space in your schedule for exploration, introspection, and creativity. For example, get involved in a graduate student organization or in another volunteer organization. Attend guest lectures outside of your department. Participate in an experiential fellowship or internship. Or take on a passion project to learn new skills and forge new connections beyond your discipline. Pay attention to what energizes and excites you as you go through your daily routine and begin embracing new experiences. Keep a record of those moments and look for patterns and gaps. Think about your values and whether you feel your values are aligned as you go through different experiences. It may sound trite, but you will be happiest when your interests, skills, and values are in alignment. Jason mentions how investing time in causes that he cared about also helped him to find meaning and purpose, both personally and professionally. Third, take note of who the people are that you admire and why. Take time to learn more about their journeys and the skills that help propel them forward, or how they navigated successes and challenges. Lastly, intentionally look for connections between your research and trends in other fields. Jason recognized that he enjoyed writing, narrating, and storytelling, and fused his passion for radio to launch a podcast with his peers. Ultimately, using his skills to educate, elevate, and advocate has become a central theme of his career. We all have multiple interests and passions, and in some cases, we may be able to infuse those in our professional pursuits. In other cases, expressing those passions may help us increase our creativity and productivity as well as our personal well-being, and find a healthy balance between work and life. Thank you for listening to the Grad Futures podcast. We look forward to bringing you another great conversation and more advice about graduate student professional development in our next episode later this fall.
The Grad Futures podcast is hosted and executive produced by me, Hellen Wainena. Editing and audio engineering by Francine Henry. Special thanks to Peter Krause. For more about Grad Futures and the podcast, visit gradfutures.princeton.edu. Thank you for listening. Till next time.